When revenue tightens, most founders react the same way. They cut costs. It feels responsible, disciplined, prudent, but in many cases, cost-cutting is not a solution. It is a signal. And the real issue is not expense volume. It is revenue flow misalignment. In uncertain quarters, founders tend to believe the primary threat is overhead. They look at payroll, software subscriptions, marketing spend, contractors, automation tools. The thinking is straightforward. If we reduce expenses, we reduce pressure. On the surface, this logic is rational. Margins improve, burn slows, cash lasts longer. The visible symptoms that trigger this reaction are familiar. Revenue feels inconsistent. Cash balance fluctuates more than expected. Accounts receivable stretch longer. Operational decisions feel reactive. So leadership moves toward control. And cost is the most controllable variable. But control is not the same as correction. Most companies that default to expense reduction are not actually over-expensed. They are under-optimized in how revenue moves through the business. And that distinction matters. Underneath the instinct to cut costs is a structural misunderstanding. Founders often assume that revenue is a fixed input. Sales come in, market conditions fluctuate, demand rises and falls, and the business must adapt around that volatility. So when cash tightens, they focus on the adjustable lever, expenses. But revenue is not just an input, it is a system. And in many businesses, that system is poorly structured. What is actually happening beneath the surface? 3 common structural gaps appear repeatedly. First, timing misalignment. Revenue may be booked profitably, but collected slowly. The business shows growth on paper while liquidity weakens in practice. Second, leakage between sale and cash realization. Discounting without discipline. Poor follow-up on receivables, scope creep, underpriced delivery. Each small friction reduces effective revenue. Third, operational drag tied to revenue generation. Slow onboarding, delayed proposals, inefficient approval chains. All of these elongate the revenue cycle without leadership realizing it. When founders cut costs first, they are responding to the symptom of liquidity stress. But the cause is usually inefficiency in how revenue is generated, captured, or converted. The flawed assumption is this: expenses create pressure. Therefore, reducing expenses solves pressure. In reality, pressure often originates from mismanaged revenue flow. And reducing investment in operations, marketing, or systems can quietly weaken the very engine that produces revenue. To analyze this correctly, we need to separate 3 lenses. Lens 1. Volume versus velocity. Most founders focus on revenue volume. How much did we sell? But liquidity is shaped more by velocity than volume. How fast does revenue move from lead to signed agreement to invoice to collected cash? A business can increase sales by 20% and still experience more stress if collection velocity slows by 30%. When cost-cutting reduces sales capacity, marketing effectiveness, or delivery speed, it often slows velocity further. Volume looks stable. Flow deteriorates. Board-level thinking prioritizes velocity before trimming capacity. Lens 2. Fixed cost versus structural yield. Cutting expenses increases short-term margin. But structural yield asks a different question. How efficiently does each dollar of revenue convert into usable cash? If gross margins are inconsistent, if delivery overruns are common, if pricing discipline erodes under pressure, the issue is structural yield. Reducing expenses without improving yield creates a leaner but still inefficient machine. Over time, this reduces strategic flexibility. A founder who improves structural yield can maintain expenses and still increase liquidity. A founder who only cuts expenses may stabilize briefly, but growth capacity declines. Lens 3. Defensive control versus offensive correction. Cost cutting is defensive. It protects against downside. Fixing revenue flow is offensive. It strengthens competitive position. When companies default to defensive control during stress, they often lose market positioning. They slow marketing. They hesitate to hire. They delay system improvements. Competitors who strengthen revenue flow during the same period increase resilience. The strategic gap emerges not from the market, but from internal reaction patterns. There is another layer founders rarely examine. When cost reduction becomes the default reflex, decision-making narrows. Instead of asking, how do we accelerate cash conversion? The question becomes, what can we remove safely? Over time, this subtly shifts leadership psychology. The organization becomes optimized for contraction rather than expansion. High-performing operators begin protecting budgets instead of improving throughput. Sales teams feel pressure to close quickly, sometimes at the expense of pricing discipline. Finance teams focus on trimming categories rather than improving receivable discipline or billing accuracy. The organization appears leaner, but underneath, the revenue engine remains structurally unchanged, and that creates hidden fragility. A business that does not understand its revenue cycle time, its conversion friction, and its liquidity lag is effectively managing in partial visibility. In that state, expense reduction feels decisive, but it is operating without full financial intelligence. Executive-level correction begins with different questions. Where exactly does revenue slow? Which stage creates the longest cash delay? Where does margin erosion actually occur? Which operational decisions unintentionally extend cash cycles? These are structural inquiries, and they produce durable improvements. When founders correct revenue flow, they often discover that cost pressure decreases naturally. Liquidity improves without contraction. Confidence stabilizes without defensive behavior. And most importantly, optionality increases. Strategic optionality, the ability to invest, hire, or expand without stress, comes from efficient revenue flow, not just lean expense structures. For founders, this distinction carries long-term consequences. If every downturn triggers expense contraction, the business develops a contraction reflex. Teams become cautious. Innovation slows. Decision-making becomes preservation-focused rather than performance-focused. Over time, this shifts company culture from growth to maintenance. More importantly, revenue flow problems compound if unaddressed. Slow receivables become normalized. Pricing discipline weakens. Approval bottlenecks remain invisible. Customer onboarding inefficiencies persist. Each quarter, leadership works harder to maintain the same result. The competitive exposure increases quietly. Markets reward companies that convert revenue efficiently, not those that simply manage costs tightly. In highly competitive sectors, the difference between stable and unstable firms is not cost base. It is revenue system integrity. Founders who consistently prioritize revenue flow optimization build resilience. They stabilize liquidity without shrinking capability. They preserve operational strength while improving financial clarity. Cost control still matters, but it should follow structural correction, not replace it. When pressure rises, the instinct to cut costs feels disciplined. But discipline is not defined by how quickly you reduce expenses. It is defined by how precisely you diagnose the system. If revenue flow is misaligned, no amount of trimming will create long-term stability. Strong companies do not survive by contracting first. They survive by correcting the engine that produces their cash. And that engine is almost always revenue flow.